this police captain whose name is Nathaniel Powers, who believes himself to be Sherlock Holmesian, is actually thought of as more of a Clouseau type. Which, even though Clouseau is bumbling, he always gets his man. Powers never gets his man.
Okay.
But you can't tell him that.
This is a Main Hustle Media podcast.
Virtual Reality Studios. A new realm of creativity.
Welcome back to Matcha, Masala, and Murder. We are back, and this, my friends, is the final episode of season 2. And so today we've got a bit of a mixed bag for you. I'm going to give you some bits and bobs. I'm tying up some loose ends. That's what I'm going to do.
Oh, that sounds good.
You're going to seamlessly crowbar some kind of National Day story in for us. And then we will be taking a bit of a break off air, but we will be squirreling away in the background as always. So new stuff will be coming your way pretty soon. So we find ourselves here. So, I mean, let's reflect a bit on what we felt about our choice to do on National Day. So on reflection, good choice or bad choice?
It was a challenge, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I do kind of, I'll stay on I liked that it forced me to research in a particular kind of way, because I think I exposed stories that I probably wouldn't have stumbled on if not for that restriction.
Same.
That being said, fuck, it was tough sometimes.
Yeah. I totally agree. I kind of liked approaching it every time, coming from a specific angle and doing really specific research and trying to sift through. That was really good. And it did definitely throw up some stories that we wouldn't have got to probably. But hence the seamlessly crowbarring, because at times it was tricky.
Man. I mean, I had to justify the serpent because of the Day of 12s, because there's 12 recorded victims. Like that was a fucking stretch, like that was a stretch. But
we've had some good ones. I think it's been, and actually it's also forced us to really dip backwards and forwards in history, I've been telling fucking werewolf stories and ghost stories, which is just ridiculous. But we've flipped around the globe, we've flipped through history, we've been all over the place. I quite like that. That's good.
And I probably would have never chosen some of the ones that I picked this season if I didn't have the restriction to make me choose it. But because of it, I actually, I learned a few things about like law creation on some of them. The one I'm going to talk about today, there's the seed planted for what would eventually become Miranda rights in the United States.
Oh wow!
And stuff like that. So I think
and we had that last week in the ghost story as well. Like that led to
the precedent.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
so,
which I also like. I'm really having to say, and I have thought about it a little bit since our episode where I'm like, should we be basing precedent on something 180 years in the past? Like even if it's justifiable. Like stuff like that. I think it's an interesting challenge that we set for ourselves.
Yes. So here we are. We find ourselves at the end. So before we get into your story, which you can tell us about in a minute, I thought I need to tie up 2 loose ends for sure.
Okay.
So the first one, I have been remiss over this season because I have not talked anywhere near enough about how many criminals have been legging it all over the place.
Fair.
Season 1, someone was legging it every goddamn week. And I never missed one. But I feel
even if it were my story, you didn't miss it. Yeah,
exactly. I couldn't help myself but point out all the legging it. So I feel like that has gone by the wayside somewhat in this season. And so number one, I'll be bringing that shit back because I love it. Number two, I will be doing some kind of graphic and getting that on t-shirts because it's amazing. We need it. And so finally, I am going to explain to you the origin of the phrase legging it, because I kept saying, oh, I might do it on TikTok, I might do it on Instagram. And then I was like, no, the real true audience needs to know it. So this, it's, you know, this is the place for it. So basically, we also, last week, we talked about, I said, I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. And then we discovered that in the US, that phrase would be with a 10-foot pole.
10-foot pole, yeah.
Right. But it all comes from the same thing. So both of these things.
The funny thing is there's nothing that we think about that would be what 10-foot pole would you fucking use? And when you said barge pole, I was like, that fucking makes sense. That's the 10-foot pole we've been talking about all this time.
Yeah.
Because pole vaulting, maybe, like, I don't know how long a pole vaulter's pole is, but I could not, it's the 10-foot pole thing. I never thought about what that pole was.
Yeah. But, you know, if you're a gondola or you're on a barge, then, you know, that's where the pole's coming from. And that is also where legging it comes from. So all of these phrases come from the fact that back in the day, before we had cars and before we had roads and motorways, we had sort of ish dirt roads and horses and cart and stuff. But horses get really tired. So if you're trying to transport any amount of cargo or trading goods up and down the country or up and down England or the UK, even though we're a small country, you've got to get that shit places kind of quickly. And if we go back to even before the railways were built, horses were too slow and weak and needed to rest too much. So what did we do? We used canals. And in our waterways, it just so happens that Birmingham, which is in the West Midlands, our Birmingham in the UK, is in the West Midlands. And it's like the second city of England. So if London is the capital, Birmingham is like it's called the second city.
Okay.
And it has more canals per square mile than Venice.
Oh, wow.
And so that's my little Birmingham fact. And considering I grew up not too far from there, that's one of those things that we were always taught at school. Did you know, little known fact, that Birmingham's got more canals than Venice? So it's not that interesting. It's not that great a fact. So there are a lot of canals. And a canal obviously is a narrow waterway, and on these narrow waterways you will find narrow boats. That's what we would call them, because they're long and narrow. And then basically you can just about get two passing each other in particular places. But because they're really long, they can't really go around bends. So you need the canals to be pretty straight. And then if you do find any inclines in the land, because a lot of the canals were man-made, obviously, they had to dig them out, because although we've got a lot of rivers, we needed a smaller network. And so you would get goods that would come into the ports, they would be transported on ships and then up the major rivers, and then they would get onto the smaller waterways, these canals. And in order to deal with difference in heights, we have these things called locks that I don't know if you have a lot of locks in the States.
We don't really. There's a few. But because fun fact, watch a lot of Narrow Boat Life.
Okay, YouTubes, so you are.
I am familiar with these locks. And they're brilliant. Like, it's such a smart idea.
It's a genius point of engineering. So basically, it allows. It is like a mini dam, a mini gateway, which water can build up, and then when you release it, the water reduces on this side and raises on this side, so that you have reached above the increment in the land. Raising, and there are these big special gates, and you get lock keepers' cottages, and it's all very picturesque and beautiful in the English countryside.
And quaint, and
it's exactly that. Anyway, the other thing is, because they were building all these canals and they had to just get wherever they needed to go, sometimes they came up upon hills and stuff that they just had to go straight through, so they had to build tunnels, and the tunnels are really, really narrow. I've got loads of pictures, so we'll put those up. But basically, only one boat could fit through at a time. So you couldn't have two passing each other. And the tunnel was basically, to maximize efficiency, they basically made the tunnels like just barely bigger than the boats themselves to get them through. And some of the tunnels, though, were like 4 miles long, which is a really long way. And the water doesn't flow really through that because, again, it's this man-made channel. It doesn't have the same current like a river would. And so what would have to happen is you would need a couple of little boys on your canal boat who would get paid, a small wage because children worked in those days. And the little lads would lie on the top of the boat on their back, and they would put their legs in the air, and they would touch the roof of they would touch the roof of the tunnel, and they would literally walk through with their feet to propel the boat through the tunnel. And that is called legging because they were using their legs.
I thought it was to do with the toe pads that are on the side.
Nope.
Wow.
And so the boys, I mean, sometimes
they had to be kids because they had to be small.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess sometimes you might have a man, but mostly because they needed short little legs. And you would actually do this. Now, fun fact, if you go to the West Midlands, there is a place called the Black Country Museum. And so the Black Country is an area in the West Midlands where it's Dudley and Smethwick, and it's called that because the air was black with smog because it was a really industrial area. And if you go there, they have this place called the Black Country Museum, which has got lots of it's like a living museum, so it's got ye olde sweet shop with a ye olde Victorian schoolroom, and you can dress up in the costumes and you can go and be a Victorian schoolchild for a day. And one of the things you can do is go legging on a boat and see if you can do it. And let me tell you, it's hard bloody work.
I bet it would be, because a fucking narrowboat is not a small piece of...
Exactly. So you've got this big vessel that's weighed down with whatever cargo it's trying to transport, coal, presumably. And it's a 4-mile long tunnel, pitch black. You've only got the little lanterns from...
That's a fucking workout.
So it is really, really hard work. And obviously,
so there's just England's filled with all these like massive thighed children and stuff like that. Like,
we won't feed this one because he's going to go up a chimney and be a chimney sweep, so he needs to be skinny. But we need to get some muscles on this leg.
Yeah,
so that he can,
they're all scrawny on top, but they just have these like huge quads and stuff.
So that is what legging it means, and that's where that comes from. So,
I would not have. I was trying to figure out how the barge stuff was going to tie to the legging stuff, and I thought it has to be the toe pads, which are these narrow pads that are on the long side of things, where like you would attach your narrow boat by rope to a horse, maybe, and the horse would propel you through certain portions of
this is it. Yeah.
Okay. That is a fun fact, because completely, I was not seeing it coming, and until you said they had to lay on their backs, and I didn't realize. I would never have. That would not have been
it's just one of those things that I suppose we get taught about at school. I suppose I got taught it because of where I grew up, so we would have done. I'm not sure whether everyone in the UK got that little weird bit of history.
The funny thing is, in the past, that definitely would have been like child labor stuff or whatever, but today that would be something that a kid would want to do as like a I can lay on the top of the boat and put, like, it would be like you could imagine a kid, not forever, of course, like even half a mile might kill the kid, but wow, that's interesting. I would not have seen that coming.
Okay, so that is one loose end which definitely needed to be tied up. So trust me, season 3 will have far more legging it. So obviously, yes, because they're trying to propel the boat to get the boat through to go on its way. So then leg it to, you're trying to get on your way. So you can see how the phrase develops.
Yeah, I can definitely see it.
The other thing is that I did briefly mention the other day, I was going to try and do some, figure out why we say knuckle duster, whereas you have brass knuckles.
Right.
And this was a really weird one, because the phrase like to eat dust, you would imagine in a fight, there's lots of different phrases, like a duster, to do with it. So it's all to do with them hitting the ground and the dust, that's all that's to do with. So that is why it's called knuckle duster. So that wasn't very satisfactory. When I found that out, I was like, well, that's kind of boring. We kind of guessed that.
A little anticlimactic, but we're okay.
Yeah, I would have preferred more interesting. So I did a little deep dive on the origins of brass knuckles and knuckle dusters for you, because I just thought I would
that's definitely Rhea vibes right there. It's like, I need to find out why this is.
Yes, absolutely that. They probably originated in 12th century India, which I was like, oh, nice. Knuckle dusters, Indian.
Nice.
according to some writings that were in Sanskrit that first mentioned, these seem to be the earliest documents that mention the use of something akin to what we would call that now. They did have them in ancient Greece and Rome, and in Rome they were called caestus, but these were more, it was more of a glove that you actually put on that had the metal or rivets built into them, which is also similar to what the Incas had. They had a glove which had metal on it. So, you know, around the world, everyone was using this same sort of technology. The Japanese had a mostly wooden version called teko, and this was used by, really apologies for any pronunciation. So this was used by shinobi ninjas.
Shinobi, yes.
Okay. Yeah, okay. And but probably the most, so they were wooden. Yeah, they were made out of different wood. But because
a lot of ninjas, fun fact, ninja weapons are farming weapons. So a lot of ninja origins comes from farm work and like the scythe, you know, things like that. These are things that would be used in farming. And I imagine if they had some kind of wooden thing, it would just be like, just thinking about being smart. Let's protect our hand. Let's protect our knuckles. Let's put some wood. Yeah, it would.
Yeah, kind of makes sense.
And, wood weapons were a big thing.
Yeah,
so.
But perhaps the most deadly version ever made of anything, you know, that's basically a knuckle duster type thing, was actually in the Punjab. So I was like, wow, this is cool, because this is definitely, you know, we've got the Japanese ones.
Yeah, we're both in this story. Yeah, nice.
So it worked out well. So the Nihang Sikhs are, they are a type of warrior, an initiated type of warrior. So the Sikhs are a martial race, anyway, known for being incredible in battle. They historically won several many battles where they were completely outnumbered. There was no way they should have won, but these guys were fucking tough, and like they just were the most amazing, well-organized armies of soldiers, brave, big guys, because of where, you know, most of the guys are quite big. They breed them big out there. And so they had this thing called the Sher Punja, which means lion's paw. And so a lot of our imagery and stuff is to do with lions being part of Sikhism and brave. And so there's a lot of like our myths and stuff have lions to do with that. And so Sher Punja meaning, lion's paw. It was actually worn on the palm side, and it was forged from metal with these massive sharp claws. So it wasn't just metal, it was actual claws. And fun. So you can imagine in close quarters this would do major damage, because the Sikhs were actually known for really advanced weaponry, that I mean, it wasn't super advanced in terms of technology, but it was so efficient and deadly. That's why it was advanced. And so we have a few of those things, and there are some really good museums and places where you can go and see the history of all our weapons, which is kind of cool. And so Nihang means immortal, and so these types of Sikhs were going to get immortality through their bravery and strength, and they were sort of a guerrilla troop warfare type people. They were totally ruthless. And then my last bit to just bring us all the way full circle is Abraham Lincoln's bodyguards in the US. They also carried brass knuckles, and these were the first kind of organized usage of them. And they were found to be so useful that they were then US soldiers in World War I could purchase them as an optional piece of weaponry for their kit, if they so chose to do so, if they could afford to. And then by World War II, they were kind of common usage for US soldiers. Would mostly all have them in particular regiments. So that brings us up to date, and that is the history of knuckle dusters / brass knuckles. There you go.
Interesting.
Something for everyone.
I like that. I like that there's like so many cultures are laced into the origin of it. But
there you go.
That's a cool one.
So I just, these are the loose ends that I needed to tie up, because if I've mentioned something briefly, I've just really, got to,
like, it just gets stuck in your craw, and you gotta
dot all the I's, cross all the T's. Which
funny.
Must bring us smoothly on to mug chat. Bit of
mug chat, which will help introduce today's theme.
Okay, shall I go first then, and then allow you to
whichever way you want to?
I've come full circle, because I think this might have been one of the first mugs that I ever used on here. So OGs would have seen this one before. This is my eyes one. It's very pretty. It's Eleanor
Yes.
Bowman, who she's a independent designer. And I like it because it holds good tea. This cup of tea is particularly disappointing. Just as an aside, there was an emergency tea purchasing situation that needed to happen, and so I was only able to purchase substandard tea bags. So Marks and Spencer's, who I'm usually a fan of, screw you, because this shit is whack.
It's not a good batch, Bubba.
So I am not recommending these tea bags, but there you go.
That's funny.
You got to do what you got to do.
Yeah. All right. So in introducing what day I chose to do today, which is I got a story in. It's not quite a line, but it's close enough. Okay. What we are going to be honoring today is Mother Ocean Day.
Okay.
because the world is covered with at least 70% of water, viewing the ocean as like life-giving water, whatever, Mother Ocean Day. Okay. So it's not to be confused with Ocean Day, International Ocean Day, which is in June.
Right.
Which is just like a general love of the ocean. In this case, it's more of a focus on like the life-giving biodiversity elements of.
So it's Mother Nature, but
the vital role that the ocean plays in our existence.
Oh, sure.
So the mug that I'm using yes, Mother Nature, but the ocean part of Mother Nature. And so when we did Mermaid Day, I didn't have a mermaid mug, and I was kind of surprised by it. So this is actually not a loose end tie. It's just tying up old shit. It's just it's a callback, I guess, basically. You know how I name dropped my friend Afua Richardson, who is the artist, comic book creator, musician. She does everything. She's amazing. And I'm in stock with her. It's fine. Who created what would be the art that Spider-Punk in the movie. Yes. Her designs were the ones that were used for Spider-Punk in the movie. So cool. She has her book that she has been working on that I will appear in as a mermaid is called Aquarius Book of Mer. She's been working on it for a couple years now, and so she has a lot of drawings of mermaids that she's already released just to kind of like, get people interested in the concept of the book when she was kickstarting it and everything like that. And so one of her designs is on a mug. And I just discovered it like a month ago. Oh. So this is one of her designs. Ooh. But it's a different play on it because she's like a koi.
Oh, yes, that's what I was going to say. It's a koi.
So it's a really...
That's beautiful. Yeah. Oh, I love it.
And, it's a real, it's a very beautiful design and stuff like that. And so when I saw it, I was like, first of all, and it's not just because I love mermaids, but I love her art too. So best of both worlds for me is, which is a phrase I hate when it comes to mixed people. I hate when people use it for mixed folks.
Oh gosh.
But anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's a whole conversation that I could get into. I fucking hate it. But in terms of supporting a friend's art and loving mermaids, this is my and celebrating Mother Ocean Day. This is the mug that I chose today.
I love it.
It's lovely, and it's really like, I don't know. There's just something about it. Like I want this piece. Actually, I would like to have it as an art piece as well because it's really a lovely design. But yeah, so we're celebrating Ocean today. And
so cute.
And if we're ready to jump, are we ready to jump from? Do you have more? Okay. So the story that we're telling that involves the ocean today is not a happy tale, but a sad tale. We're gonna be upset.
Sorry, we're in mourning. Yeah, we're
it's not going to be a great tale because we are going to be telling the tale of a murder at sea tale of the Herbert Fuller murders. Tea's ready. Shall I be mother? A carnival of murder at the high seas. That's what we're talking about today.
I'm invested.
It is, from what I found, even though it was hard to find stuff about this, there have been many books written about it, not many podcasts about it, not many documentaries about it. But it was one of the biggest stories of murder at sea at the time that it happened.
Okay.
So we are going all the way back to July 14th, 1896.
Ooh.
So 100 years before I graduated high school.
For context.
100 years older than that. This is the tale of the Herbert Fuller, which was a ship, a barkentine, I think it's called, which I don't know boats.
No,
I like boats fine enough. I don't know boats, but what I understand is that a barkentine is a type of ship that used square masts.
Oh.
Instead of just the triangle. So it had triangle masts, but then near the front, it may have had square-shaped masts. And some of those had 3 fucking sails on it, and some of them had 4. I don't know if there's a distinction. I found out just enough to be able to explain what this boat looked like. I have photos. So the Herbert Fuller was a barkentine ship that was like a cargo ship, of transportation ship, and it really didn't take that many people to man it. It had a crew of about 9 people. If you count, I guess the crew would have been more about 11 people if you count the captain and the first mate and everything like that. But this is 1896, and the ship was destined for a journey from Boston, Massachusetts to Rosario, Argentina. So it was supposed to dock in Buenos Aires, and then it was supposed to like get the cargo that was white pine lumber off of that and get to Rosario, Argentina. That was supposed to be what it was supposed to do. It was captained by a man named Charles Nash, who in very, very rare form, I guess, or whatever, had his wife with him whenever he was on the seas, which is interesting because there have been times in history where having a woman on a ship was considered bad luck.
Very unlucky. Yeah.
And a lot of people would not work on a ship if they knew a woman was on the ship.
Very true. I
don't know how this
a foreteller of what's to come.
Maybe. I don't know how this worked. Like if you literally were transporting women, like if you were transporting a family from England to the US or something like that back in the day. I don't know if that also was a part of it, but there in some areas there was this lore, whatever, that it was bad luck to have a woman on the ship. So it was very unusual. In their 17-ish year marriage, the Nashes only spent 2 years apart.
Wow.
When he was at sea. Other than that, they were at sea together.
Oh. Okay.
Their whole situation. And this is the tale of the murder of Charles Nash, his wife, Laura Ray Nash, and the second mate, August Blomberg. And it is a very strange tale because even I don't think there is a satisfactory way to get through this story. There are so many details of it, and I'm going to tell as much of it as possible. But I also want to fixate on something that is very near and dear to yours and my heart. There's a mixed person on the ship, and it's a very diverse, ethnically diverse crew. Well, it's mostly a white, ethnically diverse crew, but it's an ethnically diverse crew. There is the first mate of the ship was a man named Thomas Bram, or Bram. It's spelled like Bram Stoker's. It could be Bram. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I look at it and I want to say Bram. And he was a person that was sometimes accused of being Italian because he was a dusky.
I accuse you of being an Italian.
I don't know if accused in Italian, so I said it in French. He was sometimes accused or mistaken to be Italian, but he was of mixed Caribbean and Irish ethnicity. He was born in St. Kitts, and then there was also a black steward on the ship. So these are positions of like these two people outranked a lot of the other people, and so there was a little issue on the ship of comfortable taking instruction. A dusky Italian that was actually a mixed black person.
Well, yeah. Okay.
So they start off not well. They were supposed to cast off on July 3rd, but because of storms, they weren't really able to do anything. And one other unusual thing about this journey is that while it was a cargo ship destined to, send a shipment of white pine to Argentina, it did have one passenger on it, which was a very unusual thing. But because the ship captain was paid to transport this person, he was like, yeah, sure. This passenger was a young lad named Lester Hawthorne Monks. He was a failed and slightly sickly Harvard student. He was I think he was in his second year at Harvard, but he wasn't really doing very well academically. And for whatever reason, he just kept getting sick. And he wouldn't like to describe himself as sick, but he would say, and I don't know why, but for the last year or so, I kept getting these colds over and over again, and I wouldn't really recover from them. And so in addition to him not being very good at school, his family, who was a richer family, had opted to have him go spend some time in a warmer climate for a period of time. But I think also he might have been a little bit problematic, and the family might have wanted to kind of get rid of him for a period of time, the way rich families would like send a person off for a while. So under the guise of him being ill, they wanted to send him to a warmer climate. And his uncle had some kind of connection in Argentina or something like that. So like, we'll just send him to Argentina for a couple months, and then eventually he'll go from Argentina to England. And in Lester's mind, he was coming back to Boston eventually. In his father's and uncle's mind, maybe not. So they paid the Charles Nash to take and protect, I guess, during the time that they were transporting him, young Lester to Argentina along with the rest of the stuff. So the crew of, like I said, 11 people or 10 people, if you count the captain, plus the wife, and then plus Lester, brings the total to 12 people on this ship, which it would not occur to me that 12 people could transport a massive like shipping part, thing like that. But, sail ship. But whatever, that's what they did. So they got kind of docked in Boston Harbor for about a week and a half longer than they were expecting to, or a week longer than they were expecting to. They were finally able to cast off, I believe, on July 8th or 9th. It's kind of weird because in maritime, the day starts at noon. So while we're sitting in July 8, they're already in July 9.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. So let's say it's July 9th or so that they kind of...
It was early June.
Yeah, it's like that. They kind of cast off and finally... And so Lester is like dealing with depression and boredom because he's on the ship so that it can go whenever they want. Because they're not like on the harbor. They're like in the harbor. They're just kind of anchored. And so eventually the weather clears up enough and they were kind of tugged out to around the Cape. So if you're familiar with the map of Massachusetts or the map of the United States, Massachusetts is the state that's shaped like a flexing arm. And the part that's inside is the harbor. And this arm part is the Cape. And you kind of go around it so that you can get out to open ocean. Okay. And so they were kind of anchored here, and then they had to go around to be able to get pulled out to ocean, open ocean, and then hit the wind so that they can head down south. Okay. About 9 days into the journey, or so, 6 or 7 days into the journey, they end up having mostly clear skies, mostly everything's fine. They're heading towards Argentina, but at the night of the 14th, so like I guess the middle of the night as you're leading from the 13th into the 14th, the passenger, young Lester, is awoken by a blood-curdling scream and maybe the sounds of scuffle, but because he was in dead sleep, he does not know what he hears. Okay. So he kind of sits up and listens to try to see if he can figure out what he thinks he heard, if it was part of his dream or whatever. And then he hears another horrifically blood-curdling scream. And he, depending on which tale he's told, either puts his slippers on and loads a gun and heads on out, or he puts his trousers on and loads a gun and heads on out. He calls.
So now I've just got the picture. He's definitely got the gun. He may or may not have trousers.
He may have slippers in his PJs, or he has trousers. Who knows? But he ends up kind of calling out for the captain, but he doesn't hear anything. Yeah. And then he opens the door with his pistol, and he goes out to try to find the captain. Yeah. And what he finds instead is the captain's dead body. Dun dun dun. And from there he goes and looks at the wife's room. So the way ships are built, or at least ships in this time, in the forward part of the ship is where most of the crew was and lived and slept and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But the cabin, the main cabin that housed like the captain and everything like that, we're basically in an area that's about 450 or so square feet. But in that cabin, they have 3 rooms divided that are used as sleeping quarters. So the wife was in the main or the larger sleeping quarter. The husband, the captain, was in the chart room. So like the room that had the maps and everything like that. He would bunk in there because at that time, these are, again, small rooms, but also at that time, husband and wives didn't necessarily share a bed at night when they slept. So he slept in the chart room during this voyage because they had the passenger Lester, who was sleeping in what would have been the captain's cabin. Okay. Now the captain's cabin and the wife's cabin were joined by a door, but depending on the story that Lester tells, he either doesn't know if the doors between them are locked, or just in case they're not locked, he puts a chest up against it.
Oh, right.
Or there's no chest there.
Okay.
He just never thought to check to see if it was locked. He just wanted to make sure that like she felt safe, that he wasn't going to go into her room or some shit or whatever.
Okay.
And so he doesn't go through her room that way, but when he's in the outside of the hallway of the cabin and he sees that the captain is sort of half of his body is in his room and half of his body is in the chart room. And he looks over to the wife's cabin and he sees just what looks like a black soaked bed. And possibly body parts that he's not distinguishing necessarily, but he realizes both the captain and his wife is dead. Right. And so he creeps out even further to try to get a sense of what might be happening. And he encounters, sort of hiding at the top of the stairs, is the first mate, who's holding a plank of wood because I have no idea what I did to trigger fireworks, but for whatever reason, this fucking filter.
Sorry.
It's so weird. I have to figure out what this is because sometimes it's mad inappropriate when it pops up.
Yeah.
So like he's at the foot of the stairs with his gun, and the first mate is looking down on him, and I don't know what's triggering this part, but for whatever reason, they're looking down at each other, and because the first mate sees the guy holding a gun at him, he chucks a board at him, and Lester's the first mate is Thomas Bram, the mixed race man. So Lester's sitting here like, don't throw boards at me. The captain and his wife are murdered.
Yeah.
I need help, kind of a thing. And so he's already, Thomas is like, is it you? Like, I'm ready to fight, kind of thing, whatever. So they end up joining forces to try to figure out what's going on. And Thomas suggests that maybe there's a mutiny, because if you kill the captain, that, why would you?
Pretty much a
it
mutiny.
Seems like it might be a mutiny. And while Lester may not be aware of this, the crewmen know that Charles is a bit of a dick. And he has a reputation. So he has a reputation of being a great shipping captain in the world. But for crew members, he has a reputation of being a massively abusive and being kind of prone to like calling for his gun whenever someone dissatisfies him. And so he's also known to never keep the same people twice on any journey. So if you're hired on a Nash ship, you're just doing the one journey. Yeah. And then when the loop closes, you're gone and he moves on. The only person on the ship that he had worked with one other time happens to be the steward, which is, the kitchen guy. Okay. This is a black man whose name is Spencer. He took a liking to Spencer and he allowed him to come on to a second voyage. So they had just finished one voyage and he signed him up for the next voyage. And Spencer would say, yeah, he's a dick, but he was a good boss. It's fine. But a lot of the crew people would complain about how abusive he was, both verbally and kind of physically. But in these last few voyages, when he would get upset at a crewman, he would actually threaten them with a gun, and sometimes yelling for his wife to go get the big gun. Oh. Versus, I guess, the regular ass gun or something like that, like to be a little bit more scary. And she would sometimes argue with him, like, you don't need the gun. And he'd be like, wife, go get the gun or whatever. Yeah. And so, like, there was people who were kind of like, they couldn't, even though the journey hadn't really gotten underway where they were just like, I can't wait for this shit to be over. So when Thomas suggests to Lester that maybe there's a mutiny, Lester kind of has seen enough to be like, I guess that makes sense. Okay. So let's join forces and try to figure out what's going on so that we can stay alive. Yeah. And so they basically kind of hunkered down a little bit. They're doing a little bit of exploration or whatever. And Lester says, do you know where the second mate is? Because the second mate shares a cabin in that area as well. And he said, yeah, I saw him earlier. He's fine or something. They encounter Spencer, and I don't understand how that kind of happens, but Spencer ends up getting ready to fight because he sees a man with a gun and a man with a like a knife or whatever, and he's like, what's going on? And so Thomas says, I think there's a mutiny happening. Yeah. The captain and the wife are dead and things like that. And so they end up kind of hunkering down together. Okay. And as they explore the whole, like, everybody's dead type of thing, they notice the bloody axe. So Thomas picks up the bloody axe and he says, should I throw this overboard? Because if there's a mutiny, they can't kill us with the axe or whatever. Yeah. And Spencer says, don't do it. We should keep everything, for when we, go to the cops or whatever, leave it to a black man to have a sense in this kind of thing. He's like, don't do this. And even though, like, fingerprinting and stuff like that wasn't going to be, or forensics weren't what they are now, Spencer had the idea. Useful. Yeah. We should keep it just in case. Yeah. Thomas and Lester are like, I don't know. We want to be safe from the mutiny. So they chuck it overboard. Okay. They chuck the murder weapon overboard. They end up checking to try to go find the second mate, and they open his door. Sure enough, he's dead too. Oh my God. So Lester looks at Thomas and be like, I thought you said you saw him. And he's like, I did see him, but I guess in relation to the murder, he didn't necessarily know. Or whatever, but Lester will use this against Thomas later, and Thomas will be like, I mean, I saw him earlier, kind of a thing. It'll come back. Okay. But because of this starts to make Spencer a little, I'm not sure what's going on here. And then Thomas, who is known to not be a drunkard, he is not an alcoholic, and he very rarely imbibes. And if he does, it's only like a glass of beer at a time. While Lester, on the other hand, is a big old drunk. Thomas ends up throwing up violently, and he says, I think I've been poisoned. And Lester says, I think you're drunk. And he's like, no, I'm not, but I don't feel well now. And he's acting very agitatedly. So as the night goes on, I think his paranoia is kicking in. He's a little bit scared and stuff like that. He might have thrown up or whatever. So he tries to clean up, or he's like, let me clean this up. And Spencer's like, no, you should keep a sample of this for the police as well to see if you were poisoned. And then Thomas slips in the vomit so that it's not able to be collected. This again will be eventually used against Thomas as a way of, like, covering up evidence, because maybe he wasn't actually poisoned and he was just drunk. Yeah. They decide to hunker down until the daylight because they're like, this is too scary. We're freaking each other out. Let's just hunker down. Okay. And then when the light comes up, we'll, investigate, and we'll try to figure out who amongst the crew has killed everybody. Yeah, we'll basically wake up and see who else is dead. or that, yeah. Like that. Or so not wake up. the sun finally comes up and they get everybody onto the, you know, the main part of the ship and stuff like that. And they tell them that the captain, the wife, and the second mate are murdered. And so they all kind of collectively are trying to figure out what's going on and looking at people, you know, everybody's suspicious of everybody or whatever. Someone said, you know, did someone, you know, come on the ship and then leave? And they're like, we're too open ocean. We haven't seen anybody for miles. Someone would have noticed from the lookout. So it has to be someone on this ship. And then everybody kind of looks to one of the crew guys, the eldest crew guy on the ship, who goes by the name of Charlie Brown. This predates the peanut. Charlie Brown, whose actual name, I have to look at it, is he's a Scandinavian fella, and his name is actually Justice Leopold Wassenberg. He is the helmsman. So at the time that this murder would have been happening, from around midnight to maybe 2 a.m. ish, he was at the helm.
Yeah. Okay.
And his behavior is always a little bit off, and he tends to make people uncomfortable. So everybody started to kind of point the finger at him.
Okay.
They end up, but first they got to figure out about what they're going to do with the bodies. So they decide to carry all the bodies out, and they put them out on the main part of the ship, and everybody looks at them. And the wife was massively brutalized. Her hands were practically separated because she probably had defensive wounds.
Yeah.
She seems to be the only one that you can really tell tried to fight back.
Okay.
All three of them had suffered at least 7 to 8 slashes to the head with the axe.
Wow.
When the captain was found, he was found with sort of legs up, head down, and face down. So he may have been fighting, or he may have just been attacked and tried to get away or something like that, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. The first mate was found dead in his bed, all hacked up.
Okay.
And so they're looking at
chance to start fighting.
No, it was just brutal. It was a super brutal, very, very bloody murder. So they have the bodies all out, and they decide to leave them on the main part of the ship, but cover them with the jolly boat. So they just took like one of the, you know, like the life raft type boats or whatever. They call them jolly boats, and they put it over them. Okay. To kind of mask their bodies from the elements. They put them in bags for, like, you know, sewed up fabric things or whatever, and then they covered them up or whatever. And 3 days later, it was too much to handle, so they end up flipping the boat over, putting them in the boat, and then stringing the boat behind. So that took 3 days. But it was like 3 days of like massive, horrible smell before they were like, okay, let's put them in the back. So they ended up towing the jolly boat that had the bodies in, and they put a tarp on, stuff or whatever. And during this time when they're handling the bodies, Charlie is noted as being very careful and almost loving as he is laying them down and preparing them and stuff like that. But he does wear overalls when he's doing it. And when he takes his overalls off, he has blood under the overalls. And everybody thought that was kind of strange. Oh, yeah. And when he's seen having blood on it, he ends up taking those clothes off and throwing them overboard and changing into other clothes, which later he will say is because he was cold. But everybody thought it was kind of strange that he had blood underneath his overalls, on the clothes underneath his overalls, and also that he chucked them overboard. That seems suspicious. So they ended up putting him in irons and tying him to a part of the boat. And they're like, he's the murderer. Everybody's actually first, everybody's trying to figure out who is the murderer. People are suspicious of Charlie, but they haven't tied him up yet because they thought he was very careful and kind to the bodies. And so Thomas ends up putting forth the suggestion that we can't look to the living, is what he's quoted as saying, something to the effect of, we can't look to the living for the murderer. What probably happened was that the second mate was trying to assault the wife, and the captain discovered it and grabbed the axe, and in an attempt to kill the second mate, accidentally killed his wife, and then hit the second mate. But in a tussle, the second mate got the axe, hit him and killed him, and then went to bed and died in bed. Sure. And everybody accepted it, even in front of everybody, but later we'll all say they didn't buy any of this shit because there wasn't a blood trail to the second mate's room and all this, because he would have had a blood trail if he'd been axed, but also 8 times in the head, everybody, and like back wounds and body wounds as well, but everybody got it in the head a number of times. But what was confusing was that nobody was covered in blood. And that was such a massive amount of blood. And this is 1896. It's not like you're taking a shower on a ship. You got a bucket with water and you're cleaning yourself that way. So since no one seemed to have evidence of being like splattered in blood or whatever, it was really hard to figure out who it was. But Charlie's behavior kept agitating people. And since people were already a little bit uncomfortable with him, after a few days, he ends up being the person that they were like, it's him.
Okay.
And how they justify this is things like he tells a story about one time he had shot a man and was in a mental institution afterwards, that he was mad at the man for being in his room or something like that. And so people were like, well, if he's killed a guy once, no reason why he wouldn't do this and stuff. And so they end up saying, like, and sometimes he would just make people uncomfortable. 2 nights before the murder, or the night before the murder, he moves his mattress from the forward cabin area that the crew, they call it the foxhole, was in. He moves his mattress onto the main deck underneath like an area to protect himself from the weather. And he just said that he just wanted like fresh air when he slept, or something like that. So people thought that was kind of strange. The throwing his bloody clothes over the edge of the thing. He thought people thought was strange. So they definitely had reasons to be kind of like uncomfortable about this guy, and they lock him in irons. Because Lester was a Harvard man, they decided that they would write out the narrative that everybody, in quotes, agreed to in the log, which is normally the first mate's job to, keep a log of what's happening on the boat and on the seas and stuff like that. But they have Lester write it. But because he's a failed student, he's not that great. There's like tons of misspellings and errors and stuff like that or whatever. But essentially, he writes out a story, and I won't read all of it, but I do want to kind of read part of it because it does sort of like show you who the man is. Oh, wait, no. This is actually when he's talking to the police, but it harkens to what he wrote in the log, which is that at the time of the murder, I occupied an apartment between the chart room and the captain's cabin. To the right of the cabin was the room occupied by the second mate. At the time of the murder, the captain was in the chart room. We all retired about 11 o'clock that night on July 13th, and towards 1 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by screams. I thought I might possibly be dreaming and laid over to my side. A few seconds after I heard another scream, I realized that the alarm came from Mrs. Nash. I grabbed my revolver and took the only time to put on my trousers. So this is one telling where he says he's put his trousers on and ran out with the revolver in my hand to ascertain the cause. I had to pass the captain's chart room, and the light was burning, and I saw the captain dead on the floor. I heard footsteps in the companionway, and I followed them to the deck. There I was confronted by the first mate. He had a billet of wood in his hand and assumed a threatening attitude. I leveled my revolver at him and asked him who had committed the murder. The first mate said he did not know, and we decided to investigate. So it's just like, okay, you don't know. Fine, let's investigate together. But later, there's other tellings where it gets a little bit more detailed about what happens. And what we find out later is that he did, in fact, know that the wife was dead. But when he talks to Thomas, he acts like when they see the woman's murdered body, he acts like he hadn't known she was dead.
Okay.
So he has to double back on that later on in multiple different tellings. And he tells multiple different stories to first a reporter, then the police, then his lawyer. So like he tells a bunch of different stories. And so finally it takes his lawyer to like crystallize his story. And so you get a whole lot of different tellings. Right. So we have Charlie Brown locked up in one part of the boat. And they're all trying to figure out, what do they do? Do they push on to Argentina and, go ahead and, hand off and get paid for the supply? Yeah. Do they go to port wherever the nearest port is, which at the time, Thomas, who is the person who would navigate and chart everything out, says we're closer to French Guiana. One of the crewmen is a Frenchman who is on the run, and he goes, we can't go to French Guiana.
That's amazing.
And he's like, you know, I'm a little hot in these streets, so we can't go to any French occupied place. And they said, and actually the wind is against us if we go, even though we're closer in mileage, the wind is against us to French Guiana. And so they're I want to say they're approximately 750 miles out from Boston.
Okay.
Heading south, which is why they feel they're closer to French Guiana. Someone also suggests either Barbados or Bermuda. I forget which of the B's it is. And there's another reason. I think the wind is also against them going that way.
Right.
So the first mate says, or someone suggests Nova Scotia, and the first mate charts it, and he's like, actually, the wind is with us for Nova Scotia, which is so counterintuitive to my mind because it's north and they're heading south. And if they're closer to French Guiana and Barbados or Bermuda, that seems wild that they would turn around and go to Nova Scotia. But after Thomas charts it, he's like, yeah, actually the wind is with us if we turn around and go to Nova Scotia. So as a collective, they all agree and they head to Nova Scotia. So it's getting to the point that everybody is on edge. No one is sleeping. Everybody is watching everybody. So at night, everybody's made to kind of stand a certain distance from each other on the main deck so that everybody can see everybody, just in case just in case they don't have it right with Charlie and, you know, something's wild or whatever. And in this time, though, Spencer just can't get as out of his head as some of Thomas's behavior the night of the murders. And so they are constantly going back and forth to Charlie, trying to question him about like, did you do this? It doesn't seem like you could have done this by yourself. Who was working with you? All this other kind of stuff. And Charlie is tight-lipped for two and a half days. And then suddenly he's broken enough, because Spencer is not a small man and he's probably roughing him up a bit. He's broken down enough that he says, on the night of the murders, I saw the first mate kill the captain. Because he was the helmsman at the time. Yeah. He said that he had seen the first mate, Thomas, walking the main deck a couple of times. And then after a period of time being gone, he appears on a different part of the ship than he would have expected him to come from. Yeah. He also at some point tells another story that says at some point he had looked back into this transom window that was behind him, behind the helm, into the cabin. And then he saw the first mate kill the captain. In hindsight, or like when people did reviews and forensic stuff like that, it's impossible for him to have seen anything through this tiny, like 11 by 4.5 inch window. It also had a curtain pulled at the time of the murder. So
X-ray vision. Brilliant.
Yeah, so he says that he would look and see him murdered and then look back at the helm and check his compass. And then, the police would be like, why did you check your compass? He's like, I needed to make sure that I didn't put the boat off course while I was looking at the murder. Right. And then he was like, and I was scared for my life, so I just kept acting normal, is what he kept saying. But every so often he'd look back and into this window where he said he couldn't see what kind of weapon was, but it looked like the handle of an axe. And then he would look like he saw the bashing happen or whatever. So he claims this, and Spencer just takes it. Spencer's just like, all right, I think you're both in it and you're just giving him up, but at least you're telling the truth about him. So we're going to go ahead and arrest Thomas too. Okay. Thomas is the only motherfucker who can steer this boat though. Like who can navigate anyway. Yeah. Like, so even while he's arrested by them, they have him tied up in a different part of the boat from Charlie. Every so often they would untie him and make him navigate. And then tie him back up. And then at one point they say that they believe themselves to be off course because there's times when there's like overcast and they can't use the sextant and all this other kind of stuff. But then one day the skies clear up. They use the sextant. They're like, oh, he was sending us off a different path. But mind you, it was overcast the whole time. So they were doing the best. I assume they were doing the best that they could do given the circumstances. Okay. So they're kind of adrift outside of, they're relatively close to where Nova Scotia is, but they're just kind of adrift because the wind is not with them at this point. Like it got them up there, but then it just kind of went flat, and so they were just adrift. Finally, a pilot ship or boat, like a teeny tiny little pilot boat, is out there, and they're like, "Yo, where's Nova Scotia?" And he's like, "You're about 100 miles off." So they find them to like tug them to Nova Scotia so they can finally, and there's fog the whole time. So they're lucky that they got there. And in that time, you know, like I said, that they had written out the statement. They had Lester write out a statement that everybody agreed to, and everybody on the ship signed this to say they were all in agreement of the narrative of the story that they agreed to.
Okay.
When Lester noticed he had like misstated something or misspelled something, he would change it and then have everybody sign again and stuff like that. So they had this like thing. They dock in Nova Scotia. The police are called, but everybody said you could smell the bodies from a mile, so people would come to try to witness the thing. And then as they pulled the bodies out, people would faint or pass out, both from the grotesqueness of it but also the smell. And they end up arresting everybody on the boat. Everybody's arrested. But they're all arrested in like different levels. So Lester, being a Harvard man, a very typical Harvard man as he's described, was put up in sort of like the city hall building, which also kind of housed the police at the time. They put him up in like the main captain's or chief's office. That's how he was jailed. Spencer, being the steward, who was also the one who had the most to say, they kept him and all the other crewmen together in like the proper jail cell, or in a space that was big enough to house all of them. And then Charlie and Thomas were jailed in 2 different jail cells. Lester was given food, a better place to sleep, and he was allowed to send a telegram to his family. And so he just sends a telegram to his father that says, in Nova Scotia, come now, or something. So his father's just like, what the fuck happened? Because he's thinking his son's on the way to Argentina. So he ends up doing a little rich man investigating, and they end up finding out that yes, in fact, there is some kind of story about a murder on the Herbert Fuller, and that everybody is in jail in Nova Scotia. So he gets his brother together and a lawyer, and they fuck off to Nova Scotia to try to help their son and figure out what's going on. In the meantime, this police captain, whose name is Nathaniel Powers, who believes himself to be Sherlock Holmesian, is actually thought of as more of a Clouseau type. Which, even though Clouseau is bumbling, he always gets his man. Powers never gets his man. But you can't tell him that. He is known to have massively miscalculated some major cases that happened in Nova Scotia. In one case where like the Prince George was going to be there, he arrests 2 men in a plot, what he thinks is a plot to kill the prince, the future king of England, because they were found with dynamite and a whole bunch of other stuff or whatever, but they were just coal miners that were carrying their equipment so they can blow up this area so they can dig for coal, right? So if there was a plot, I don't know if that happened or whatever, but he ends up arresting these guys, and it ends up coming out, no, you were wrong about this. And even Prince George was like embarrassed by the whole scenario. So there's a couple of the situations like that where he just like completely gets the wrong guy, and he's in charge of this whole situation. Great. So rather than interviewing Lester first, he allows the fucking Halifax Herald to interview him first. So what I read earlier was the Herald's detailing of what Lester Monks tells him. The next day, they allow the Boston Globe to talk to him. And he tells a different story to the Boston Globe, which is similar points, but it's like I said, slippers versus trousers. Whether or not he knew she was also murdered and things like that. The order of things is all wrong across the board. And it's like he's the 3rd person to interview Lester. Right. He and by this time also like the uncle and the lawyer and stuff like that are there too. When he's interviewing Lester, the father's there, the uncle's there, the lawyer is there, and a representative from the media is there. And this is all like, Your police, what's going on?
Yeah. Wow.
when they interview Lester and Spencer and a number of the other crew people, and then they get to Thomas and Charlie. So they have already decided their story by the time they even get to Thomas and Charlie.
Yeah.
And Spencer is focusing more on Thomas at this point, but he is suspicious that maybe Charlie was involved and things like that too. And the reason why is because he believes that if the captain is murdered, Thomas would be able to salvage the ship and get money for it. Now, the mutiny story makes a little bit more sense because if Thomas brings the ship in, Thomas is eligible for the salvage money. If the crew brings the ship in, all the crew members could get up to $500 a piece. Okay. So it's important to look at both ways, but Spencer is really convincing about Thomas. And so they end up focusing in on Thomas. Okay. And when Powers, the police chief, interviews Thomas, he's talking to him with full confidence that you are the killer. Right. And Thomas says something which I suppose could be construed a couple of different ways. Okay. But what he ends up saying is, I have full Thomas says, I'm absolutely innocent of this. And Powers says, I am fully convinced that you are the perpetrator of these murders. Charlie has given us, an explanation that he saw you kill the captain, and he says he couldn't have seen me kill the captain, which the police chief interprets as he knows he killed him and no one was witnessing. Right. Yeah. But Charlie's position is, if I didn't kill him, he couldn't have seen me kill the thing. So that's obvious. So then he ends up saying he saw you through the transom window. And then even Spencer says there's no way he could have seen him through the window. He's still convinced that Thomas is the one, but there's no way Charlie could have seen it and stuff like that. But Powers is just like, I got my man. I know what it is. Meanwhile, no one's unarrested. Everybody's still arrested this whole time. Now you get the consulate involved, but when he gets there, he manages to sort it so that everybody had to get to Boston. They were going to try this in Boston. And so he made the arrangements to get everybody carted down to Boston. And they wanted to even get the Herbert Fuller pulled down there. But at that point, they did a little bit of forensics. They managed to tug it somewhere to Boston, but then somehow Spencer was able to take over and sort it out. I think they allowed a new crew to go and take it down to Argentina so that eventually the wood got sent there, but they were able to get the salvage money. And somehow in all this, I think Spencer ends up with part of the money. Maybe the cast and crew does, or the cast and crew. Maybe the crew does. But for whatever reason, the Herbert Fuller is not docked in Boston during the investigation or the trial, which seems insane. Right. Yeah. Okay. They get everybody down to Boston. They're going to try Thomas for this. Meanwhile, everybody is still in some form of imprisonment for a period of time. Eventually, a lot of the crew gets released, but they have to be back. They're obligated to stay in Boston. They're not allowed to take another ship during this time or whatever. Some of them, like Spencer, ends up in New York for a period of time to pay off a debt, and then he comes back. So like people are able to move around, but they just can't take another ship. They have to be available for the trial. The trial ends up being this wild thing. Thomas gets a lawyer called Cotter and another one I think called French, and they really do not think Thomas is guilty of this, and they're doing their best to try to make sure he is not convicted. The lawyer for the prosecution his name is Whore. Whore is like he's just wild. He is leading questions the whole time. He is giving the crew people and Charlie in particular a whole lot, so that then when they tell the narrative that they tell, it keeps pointing back to Thomas. And even though he's called out on a couple times, he still gets away with it quite a lot. And for example, like Charlie is on stand and Cotter is talking to him about, is it true that you were in an insane asylum? And he has a thick Scandinavian accent. He's not he speaks English, but he's not always clear on things and stuff. And he's like, I don't know what that is. And they're, like a hospital for the mentally insane or whatever. And he's like, no, like I was in a hospital, or something like that. He never even admits that he's in a hospital during this time.
Okay.
So he's like, is it not true that you shot a man and stuff like that? And you had to go away. And he's like, no, none of that is true. That was just a story I told or something.
Okay.
And then the next day, Horror puts Charlie back on the stand and basically asks the same questions that Cotter asked. But Charlie tells a different story. Charlie says, yes, I was in a hospital for 14 days. They said I was staying at a place in Nova Scotia, and another tenant came into the room. So I told the land people, I don't want anybody. I want this to be my room. And he said, and then 14 days later, I wake up in a hospital. And he was like, so what are you talking about? And he's like, well, they tell me that I'm forgiven. And so that I didn't do anything wrong. But what they say is that the man came into my room. I didn't like it. I shot him. And then 14 days later, I wake up in a hospital, and that they forgave him because he was drunk or something like that. And he goes, okay. So first he tells Cotter, I told a story about killing somebody and being in a mental institution. Then the next day he tells Horror, I was forgiven, and I don't know if I shot somebody, but 3 people told me I shot somebody.
Okay.
And then for 2 weeks, he was just in a coma or some shit, and then wakes up. So Cotter gets back on the stand to redirect, and he's mad. He's like, why didn't you tell me this? You knew what I was talking about. He's like, I never heard of an insane asylum. I didn't know what you're talking about. And he's like, and it didn't sound like the same story. And he's like, how the fuck didn't it sound like the same story? And so they get so fixated on it that at one point the judge just has to get in and be like, everybody needs to calm down.
Yeah.
So they go away from Charlie and they put Spencer on the stand. But before they put Spencer on the stand, because mind you, again, Spencer is a black man. Horror has to tell the jury, which is of course 12 white men, don't be distracted by the fact that Spencer is a black man. He's actually very well spoken, and he's the one who has been able to solve this case for us. So basically, show him enough respect as a hero in this respect, but like, don't let his blackness get in the way of convicting the mixed guy. Yeah. So they get Spencer on the stage, and every now and then it's a little bit antagonistic or condescending, but they basically still get out of him. Oddly, even though he is a witness for the prosecution, he actually does a better job in for the defense. Okay. Because every time they're like, isn't it true that Charlie saw the murder took place? And he's like, it's impossible for Charlie to have seen the murder take place because the window had a curtain over it. Yeah. And the next day the curtain was pulled open. The curtain was pulled open. And I asked who pulled open the curtain, and Charlie was like, I did. And he's like, closes the curtain again. He's like, leave this alone. Leave this curtain alone. Because during daylight with a lot of light, you could see in, but at night it was impossible. There's no way. It was a kind of a frosted window anyway. Plus it had a curtain. And so every so often the curtain would open again, and Spencer would be like, who opened this goddamn fucking curtain? And it was always Charlie. So when he's talking about, like, he's the one who's put forward Thomas, but every time he says something, he kind of puts the focus back on Charlie a little bit. And even like when Lester would tell a story, he would contradict Lester's story too. And he's like, Lester is just a dummy or whatever. He's just a rich guy that is telling the truth. This is what really happened. So it was a bit messy after Spencer got on the stand. But ultimately Thomas was convicted of killing. And it would come up every so often. They would be like, Charlie didn't like taking instruction from, a half-breed type of thing or whatever. And then Thomas would get mad and say, he wouldn't explicitly say he wasn't black, but he wouldn't. Yeah. He didn't like being called out for being a mixed person or whatever. He also had a German wife who had a little bit of money. And even though he had abandoned her and the children, he would kind of respect and harken back to her a lot and stuff like that. Spencer's big thing with Thomas was that Thomas said first that he didn't think the captain deserved the wife. and that that like wearing a pretty dress would do really wonders for the wife. And then sometimes he would say she's a phony and she's putting on airs. So that was part of why Spencer thought maybe he had tried to assault the wife, and then it turned sideways or something like that. But again, it's not really clear who actually did it, but Thomas was convicted for it. Thomas petitions the Supreme Court, and they vacated his sentence. And based off of the fact that when Powers interviewed him, he didn't tell him he didn't have. He did tell him he didn't have to answer the questions, but he didn't tell him he should have had a lawyer.
Okay.
And so, like I said earlier, this is the seeds of what would eventually become the Miranda warning thing, is that the Supreme Court allowed him to vacate his sentence based off the fact that the way he was interviewed by Powers did incriminate himself in the view of Powers. And he should have been told he didn't have to do that, but he wasn't told that. And so while Miranda rights weren't necessarily written in law, there was an understanding that you couldn't use something to incriminate yourself against you in your court trial. So they threw out his police statement and retried him. But he was convicted again because, again, same issues. He's a mixed race person. Everybody was kind of going in that direction, so they convict him again. 17 years he's in prison. He multiple times has been put up for possible pardon, partially because there were a lot of people that were really bothered by it. There didn't seem to be enough evidence to convict him. Something seemed weird about Charlie, and the mutiny story started to get some weight, where people were like, if Thomas brings the boat in, Thomas gets the money, but if the crew brings the boat in, everybody gets a little bit of money. And because Thomas wasn't a drinker, wasn't really prone to violence, there was some people who said it just didn't make sense that even though he was kind of a shady dude because he abandoned his family, it just didn't make sense that he was a murderer. Where people on the ship, it seemed like it was more possible. So there's a few times where he might be up for exoneration, and then something would pass and it just wouldn't go through. But finally, this female author from Maine ends up writing a novel. She definitely didn't believe it was Thomas. So she ends up writing a novel about the story of the Herbert Fuller. She changes a lot of things. She makes it far more sadistic, like mutiny, obvious and stuff like that. She paints Thomas in a very nice light. She paints Charlie. She changes the name of Charlie, but she paints him as like really, really bloody and things like that. And so she's friends with Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt likes her book and thinks Thomas didn't do this. So Teddy Roosevelt tells Woodrow, you should exonerate this guy. So he gets exonerated in 1913. All off of this recommendation of this novel that Teddy said and whatever. So he gets because at this point he's in prison in like the Georgia area. He ends up in Atlanta for a period of time doing odd jobs, but he's just kind of fucking miserable because he's an ocean guy. He needs to be his lifelong dream was to own a boat and captain his own ship, which is part of the thing that was used against him. They thought he was going to try to steal the ship and become the captain of it or whatever. So eventually he ends up earning enough money where he was able to co-purchase a boat with somebody else, and he ends up captaining it. He has a less than stellar captaining history after that, but ultimately he's still kind of listed as the murderer, although exonerated. And that's the unsatisfying thing about it, is that it seems like a very big miscarriage of justice against Thomas, even though he was eventually released. But no one has determined who's the fucking murderer. That being said, there is an author who wrote a book. So the book that I read/listened to was called Murder Aboard. And it's the one that gave me more of the detail of the trial and everything like that. But there's this other book that was released called Not a Gentleman's Work. And this one's written by Gerald Colpill. And I didn't get a chance to read this one. But I have listened to this man talk about it. And he did this huge, crazy, obsessive deep dive into the story. He read through the 56,000 word transcripts of the trials and everything like that. And while he wasn't explicit in anything I read or listened to, based off of some of the stuff, the summaries, I think he thinks it was Lester.
Okay.
Because Lester did have an alcohol problem. In fact, he brought alcohol on the ship, and he shared it with a few people.
Okay.
He also was the one who kept saying Thomas was drunk, even though Thomas was known to not be drunk. He told multiple different stories to the press and to the police. And to court. He changed the story by the time he was in court too. And later in life, he ends up having a lot of domestic violence related problems with his wife and stuff like that. And so the idea that like his family was trying to get rid of him by getting him, somewhere else, was probably that he had some unreported, but because he's rich,
cover
issues, domestic violence related things. And so because he shared a door with the wife, it is believed that he probably passed through that door, tried to assault the wife. Maybe she wasn't cool with the advances, and the husband came in and killed him or something like that. But the coroner had decided that the wife was the last person to die. So it's possible that like he's trying to assault her. The husband comes in. He kills the husband. They fight and kill her husband. And maybe just because there's been too much noise, he goes into the second mate's cabin and kills him too, just in case, because those are the people all sleeping in close quarters. And then he goes back to kill the wife. But again, forensics being what it was back in the time, who knows the order, the actual order that everybody died in. It just seems that the wife took the most brutal brunt of everything. So that is the unsatisfactory tale, closure to the tale of whether or not justice was served, which it doesn't seem to be. And even if Thomas was the murderer, the way in which things went, it's kind of like what I begrudgingly said last time about the death of O.J. Simpson, is that while I do believe O.J. Simpson to be the murderer of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron, I do think that based off the way the law works here in the United States, the jury actually did the right thing. So based on how he was tried, he was kind of convicted based off of sort of racism and really shoddy police work. And another thing is that by the time the second trial comes around, they do have the Herbert Fuller docked, and they do go to the ship and they kind of look through the window to see and all that kind of stuff. But they considered part of that inadmissible because by that point the ship had been kind of scrubbed down. And so they felt that like, even though you could stand at the wheel and look back and all this other kind of stuff, they felt like that should have been thrown out. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's in the story about like how long you could lash the wheel with ropes and keep it on course to give Charlie a chance to go and do the killing. No one ever brings up whether or not it was Spencer, even though Spencer was pretty heavily involved in like turning the attention towards Thomas. And, whether or not it was a mutiny, and everybody agreed on a different story. Like there's a lot of stuff to this case. It's actually quite bigger than I was able to tell, but that's what happened.
Okay, it is. There are definitely a lot of possibilities. Although I have to say, when you said that there was the other book that you hadn't read, and his supposition was Lester, I was thinking, that's where I was going.
I feel like it's Lester.
It seems like the most likely, right?
There's also a part I wasn't able to get into too, where like that night he happened to be reading a very famous like maritime author, crime author kind of guy's book, where he was telling another true tale of a ship captain. So he says the ship captain and wife being murdered, but actually the story he was reading, the captain saves everybody and isn't murdered, but there is like a mutiny on the ship or whatever. So he calls it a coincidence that he happens to be reading that book and the same story occurs on his ship. And it's not
very few coincidences.
Yes, and the Boston Globe goes. It literally writes, he claims this is a coincidence. He claims it's another coincidence, although never brings up anything else that is a coincidence. But also the story he references doesn't play out like the story of Herbert Fuller. So that was just like a note, like it's a little weird. Like no one ever calls Lester out,
Yeah.
but the Boston Globe does kind of go like,
yeah, okay, I see it. Yes,
and then just like privilege being what it is.
Right. That feels that that doesn't feel like a stretch at all. To imagine that. Okay. And I think that I mean, I hate the fact that there was this bumbling detective, who was the one who ended up being in charge of it. I would have preferred for there to be a nice, good, thorough investigation. But it also, I mean, the way, like, when you were telling it, the way I'm visualizing it is, it was really easy to visualize, but it felt really cinematic. Like, especially, like you said, the night when they were all like out on the deck and they were all, just trying to stay awake and suss each other out and everything.
And they're just like,
this would make such a great movie.
8 days of not being able to sleep, and you could just imagine, like, if mutiny was on the table, that could have been a time where everybody fucking dies because everybody's tired, everybody's being kind of held at bay.
Wow.
The two people that have guns are Lester and Tom. Wait, did Thomas have a gun? He either had a gun or yes, he had a gun.
Okay.
But then, like, Thomas gives the gun to Spencer that night. And then Spencer says, and then Thomas says, give me your gun to Lester. And Lester's like, you ain't getting my gun. So, but yeah, there's like a whole bunch of things.
It would make a great movie, actually.
Because even if you don't know for sure who did the killing, everybody did something stupid or fucked up. And the level-headed thing with Spencer was like, keep the murder weapon for evidence, keep the bodies for evidence, and stuff like that. But which, if he's the guilty party, even though he was never a suspect, he's saying things that would have looked good in his favor. So everybody who's like, no, get rid of everything, because they wanted to bury the bodies at sea. Thomas wanted to bury the bodies at sea. Spencer was like, no, we're keeping them for evidence.
Yeah, God. Can you imagine what would have happened if they got back and been like, oh yeah, there was all these murders, but we've got no bodies and we've got no murder weapons.
And we're just going to take the ship. Yeah. Eventually the ship gets bought by somebody else. It gets renamed and it stays in service for like another 13 years or so before it's finally, it burns. It stays in service and then like a fire happens and it like burns at sea or something. So like everything about the story, like there's elements that you can really get into deeper, and I don't know that I've done the story justice, given like every time I learned something new I was like, oh, you gotta include that, but there's just so many layers to it that I think as a movie this would be, or as a series even, this would be crazy, because you could really point to anybody and be like, tell the story as if this guy killed them, tell the story as if
that's really cool. I love that idea. Okay, well, you heard it here first.
Yeah. Nice. And I'm surprised, given like as I got into it, I'm like, why aren't there podcasts about this? Like, I think I saw 3. I didn't listen to any of them, but I think I only saw 3. And maybe it's because you can't really tell who killed them or something like that. But it's also just hard to find like written resources that aren't behind a paywall. So like Nova Scotia has some stuff, but you can only see a few pictures before you have to pay to get into the rest of the story. There's archives about like some of the evidence, the same thing, you have to pay to get through it. But the court because court transcripts and stuff like that is supposed to be available here in the US. You can get the trial documentations and stuff like that too. So I read as much as I could in like the 6 or 7 days that I was going through it. So I don't even know what I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. We always, we do challenge ourselves in that way, that we've only got a finite amount of time to get to grips with all these cases as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's what we've always said, isn't it? There's loads more information out there we might not have been able to have access to. Think new developments can happen at any time. So we've got for you what we've got for you. Come on, people. This is good.
So I'm going to link the 2 books, both the one that I listened to, thank goodness for Audible, because it really helps you get through a story, in the amount of, especially like if I don't research this like a month in advance or something. Like with Bram, I had been researching that for quite a while. I'll link the 2 books. I think I'm going to get the other book though, because at this point I feel incomplete
Yes.
And maybe if I learn some more, I can come back with a part 2 later and be like, it was fucking Lester. And here's how, I don't know. But I lean towards it being Lester because he's the discoverer of the bodies. Everything seems kind of strange. And if anybody had time to clean themselves up,
yes, that's a good point.
Time and space, because the crew is all forward.
Yeah.
You're in your own space. If you've killed everybody that's in the shared cabin and you don't have to worry about anything until you have to interact with the people up top. And he was always fuzzy about what time, like all that kind of stuff,
Yeah. And also, who has access to multiple outfits, like,
yes.
A lot of these guys are going to have, literally the clothes on their backs. And,
and he definitely could have changed clothes and thrown them overboard, and nobody would know how many outfits he had. No, he also, that's another thing they mentioned. He traveled heavy. This bitch had trunks on trunks on trunks is basically what he had. That's another thing I forgot to mention, that they kept remarking on how much this guy traveled with. He traveled with alcohol, he had clothes, he had that's the other thing. He lied about the gun. He tells people that he doesn't normally carry guns, but before he got on the ship, he noticed he was near a gun store, so he decided to pop in and got a gun in case, even though he's not prone to gun violence. He's like, just in case. But what actually happens is his uncle was like, no, I gave him the gun to keep him safe while he was on the boat. So it's public knowledge that,
all over the place, though.
Yeah, he's just lying left and right. And if you're gonna lie, you have to know your story down. You have to be able to tell it in the same way with just the slightest bit of variation, so that you don't contradict yourself, but that you look like you're naturally telling the truth. Because telling the truth just be
reciting the same thing.
So people who tell the truth tell the same story, but there's always some small variation.
Good
if point. You're telling a rehearsed lie, you tell it exactly the same every single time.
That's a giveaway. Good point.
And if you're lying and you're not keeping track of your fucking lies, you're either wearing new slippers, new trousers, fucking yellow pajamas, or all kinds of stuff. You bought a gun or your uncle gave you a gun. And listen, I know the difference between whether or not I bought a gun or my uncle gave me one. So that's a weird lie to get busted on. That's what gets me about lying too. I've talked before about how sensitive I am about this. Yeah. But the way people lie sometimes is so fucking stupid. You're like, in all these cases, you'll hear something about she used to come over every night I ain't seen the bitch in 3 months.
Yeah.
Which one is it? And it's stuff that happens in these cases all the time. And in this case, it's such an unimportant lie to tell, because no one got shot. You were just holding people at bay with the gun to protect yourself at that point. Yeah. So why tell?
So the gun in itself isn't incriminating.
It's not technically.
But the lie about it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good point. Oh.
So one of the things that happened in this case too was the question of whether or not you bring something from the past in. And so with Charlie, the thing was like, can we tell the story about his mental institution thing and the shooting as a way to show that even though these people were killed by axe and not gun, was this enough to say he is prone to this because of his past? It's the same thing with Lizzie Borden comes up in this discussion too, which I will eventually, because I have a personal connection to the Lizzie Borden story, so I'll eventually tell it even though everybody knows it. She had bought a poison of some sort weeks before, and they said, could you enter that into evidence because it's known to kill people? So did she already have homicidal thoughts, but she just happened to axe murder everybody? Which I disagree. She did not. I don't believe she's the killer, but that's a different story. But in this case, is it important enough to state she bought poison, which also could be used on rats and shit? She bought poison, and then 2 weeks later, her family was axe murdered. Yeah. Is that evidence of her being a murderer?
Right. Yeah.
Charlie, he actually did kill somebody, but with a gun. These people were killed by axe. is it enough to make that connection? And that is something that happens in, at least American justice a lot, whether or not you can bring something from the past as evidence, which is why Harvey Weinstein's New York conviction was vacated, because they said that because they talked to other women, not witnesses who saw him attack the woman he was on trial for, that should be stricken. That's literally doing the exact same thing, exact same MO, but that was vacated in New York. So now he's got to do the California bit. So
wow. There we go.
It's a loaded story, and I can keep going, so I got to stop talking now.
Okay, well, I loved Murder at Sea, and I'm very much here for that. And so if you could just do me a favor, get the other book, read it, write the script, and let's get on that.
Let's do that in part 2. I think I will, because I do kind of want to see some of these play out in the world.
Yeah, definitely, But, okay, so thank you. And just as a way to round us off, considering you brought up that we touched on OJ the other day, and we want to kind of round things off. So just I know we've already spoken about the mini update in the Jill Dando case.
Oh yeah.
So I thought it would be remiss of us not to, we've got to talk about that just briefly, because then we can wrap things up. But just to say that a newspaper here in the UK has reported front page news and images to say that they're pretty much accusing a Serbian guy of being the murderer. And we've all seen some of the CCTV footage, and we've heard the witness reports of the sweaty man who was running, who jumped on the bus, right?
With the divot in his...
Yeah, it's here on the bridge of his nose. Yeah, he's got a line there. And so if you look at basically there was the report of that man running right by the scene. There was a report of him on the bus. The CCTV footage of him entering the tube station, but literally turning back around and coming straight back out again. And then
that's a weird image.
What is going on there? And if we now look at the photo of this guy in comparison, experts have looked at the two images and decided that the science that they do of people's faces, it matches, apparently.
Like while like the main shape of the face doesn't match, the certain characteristic stuff like the divot and things like, and the sunken
high points on the cheek. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like those things are too specific and not like not every single person you walk past looks exactly the same. For you not to say that they got as close as they could with like, I'm telling a random guy who hasn't seen the guy what he looks like,
And when we talked about this at length, in previous episodes, we have, I did mention the whole idea that it was the Serbians. So
you did.
This is not an unlikely scenario. It's really bold for them to have gone front page with it. And I know because we were discussing behind the scenes that,
like allegedly.
Sure.
Let's go ahead and just put it out on the front page.
That's the thing. That's not even alleged anymore. You're just straight up saying like, it was obviously him. So, are they trying to force him out? Are they trying to just be able to get him to come forward so they can rule him out? He's got form, he's the kind of guy that they were expecting, military situation. So that could be a major development. There are still people who are saying, no, they, the right person was done for it, but like the evidence is not there for.
And that's another good example of like a person that's off and is possibly convicted just because he's like socially unacceptable.
That guy was definitely a Rogan. That guy had definitely done crime. That guy was and also mentally unstable. I 100% think that he's guilty of a lot of things, but do I think he's guilty of that? Doesn't look like it.
Is it as satisfying for someone to be convicted and jailed for like the wrong thing?
Yeah, exactly.
If they did other things.
Yeah.
And this goes back to OJ too. People were kind of like, well, at least he's in prison now once he beat up the guy and the Heisman and all that kind of stuff. And so he did the 9 years or something in prison. And people were like, at least he's serving time. Because they were thinking about it as relation to the murders, not necessarily as the beating up somebody and kidnapping and extortion type of stuff. Like, I don't know that it's as satisfying. I don't know that it is as satisfying.
especially not in a situation where like if we think about that and we're saying that Barry George may have done some bad things that he might have deserved some prison time for, but in that case, even if he didn't do the murder of Jill Dando, then somebody did, so that person is still at large. So
that part,
that's the problem with this version. So
yeah,
that is just the mini update. More on that as we get it.
Interesting. Yeah,
but I just thought we should touch on that briefly before we head off.
Right. So I do hope that this story was worthy of a season finale, since we are going to be taking an air break of about a month or so.
Yeah.
So, but like, I think also one other part that I don't know, the language is failing me on this, is looking forward to, or whatever, is, this was a tough season for me to come off of the death of my husband and still try to perform as best as I could. And while this is my little glimmer of joy in my life, because it's something I look forward to every week, and I get to hang out with you and talk about a subject I'm already fascinated about, in like watching back and doing the edits, like I can see a different version of me than that I'm more comfortable with. And I know I'm a fully changed person and everything like that. So like, closing this season out, I think in my mind, I'm kind of hoping it closes out I don't know who this person is that's on the screen, so that the next time we come back, I hope that I kind of know her again. Even though I'm, I know I'm changed. I know that I'm changed, but I do feel like this was all the challenge of this season was not just that we like set ourselves a challenge.
Yes, of course,
but it was also like literally talking through moments that sometimes remind me of what I went through, even though my husband wasn't murdered. It's been a tough
listen, I know that obviously, I remember we talked about this at the beginning, that in the immediate aftermath, people were saying to you, oh, how can you go and talk about the murder? And it's like, well, it's not the same. But sure, naturally, of course, certain things are going to come up. That would be weird if you didn't feel those things. But I think that it's you're going to always see, you're always going to carry that, so you're always going to see parts of that. But I know what you mean about trying to find some kind of equilibrium between
I just need to bridge a gap. I think it's kind of like me going to the movies again was a way of like, when I'm sitting there in the movies, sometimes I feel normal, sometimes I don't, but sometimes I do. And so like in this new phase where I'm actively trying to recapture at least activities that I enjoyed prior, I hope I feel a little bit more like myself, in whatever way.
The thing is, in this way though, it has been absolutely amazing, because we've at many times we've said, I've checked in to say with you, like, are you okay, like, are you sure do we still want to be doing this, or do we want to change it, or leave longer gaps, or we've always been very flexible with each other about the structure of everything, but it's just it is amazing to me that you've managed to show up and do this in the way that you have, which has still given us the opportunity to like do massive crazy deep dives and laugh a lot. Even though we're talking about this kind of stuff, we still managed to laugh a lot throughout it, which is, and
I've never been able to reconcile that. Like even prior to Tristan's death, like I never understood why I can both like be so intensely interested and sometimes find something to laugh about. Especially in the quaint ones, it's a little bit easier because you're that far removed. The historical ones, you're that far removed. But sometimes it is something like with the serpent, which was in more closer to modern times or whatever, and he's still alive. It's like, if he wasn't murdering people, his story's fucking cool. Like you're kind of interested in this, but then he's a murderer, and you got to think about like, ew, that,
Very true.
So it's so weird. Like I do not know if I'll ever be able to reconcile why. I don't know if it's just compartmental. I don't know what it is. I don't know why we can laugh about this sometimes, but like everybody who does this does that.
That's right. I think you have to. So so we're all in good company with that, at least. So,
and then just given how many things we have shared interest in that may not have anything to do, but like us tying the tea, the matcha masala and stuff into this or whatever. Which I don't know why true crime podcasters is always a beverage. It's there's the coffee ones, the tea ones now with us, and the drinking ones. They're all over the place.
And you'll know when we're really going downhill is if we start replacing the tea with something a little stronger.
Yeah, like if it gets a little bit stronger, we need to stop talking about this. But yeah, so next season we have not agreed yet to what our focus is, or if we're gonna do a focus. I know the first season we weren't intentionally doing a focus. We just ended up having a number of like Black Widow types. Not a lot. I mean, there was poison and Black Widowness, I guess, in the beginning. This one we had a very specific accidental thing with the specialty days. We'll see what we end up doing for the next season. But I gotta say the challenges are interesting because I think it might give us an opportunity to tell stories that most of the other true crime podcasters may not have told, which
and that's
today is an example of.
Yeah, and that's something that we have always been interested in, isn't it? And finding the we don't want to just be shouting into the same echo chamber everybody else. We want to be providing different content and also our own spin on the content that we're talking about. So we're obviously going to keep some of those through lines with the cultural aspects and analyzing them through our own particular lens that we like to do. So yes, we will be back. We will return.
We'll be back. So just keep the kettle on. We can show up at any moment. No.
We'll give you a heads up. And we'll be back. So until then,
follow us on all the social medias. You guys know the drill. If you stay till the end of the episode, I don't fucking know. We'll see you next season.
3.
3 to 3. I was doing peace, but then I know peace is different in all the different cultures. So
Matcha and Masala is produced and hosted by Sharmane Fury and Ria Maya Kaur.
This is a Main Hustle Media production in association with Virtual Reality Studios. All stories are researched to the best of our ability with information freely available to the public.
This podcast is intended for entertainment purposes, and due to the nature of true life crimes, some information remains inaccessible and new information can come to light after recording.